Oh, I am so grateful to welcome my guest, Jeff Holloway from Luminos Consulting. Jeff, welcome to Stories from the Field.
Good morning, Will.
Good morning. It's a Monday morning this summer, actually July of 2025. And we're both a little bit gray on the top, right? We've been around for a while, but I don't know your journey. Like, how did you? I know you've worked in the helping profession for a very long time. What was your journey to choose to work in this field?
And it is a long journey as you talk about the grade coming in here. So, believe it or not, I initially went to college at Iowa State to be a veterinarian. And I was in my pre-vet med program. And one year I decided to stay at school and work with some underprivileged kids. And I absolutely loved it. I probably spent the next 2 years doing that to the chagrin of my parents. I decided maybe that's more of an area for me than being a vet. And so I took a year off. Showing my age, I grabbed the yellow pages and went down looking at social services and said, I need to work with kids to see if this is really what I want to do. And as we all know, the residential program, when I called and said, hey, are you hiring? They said, of course you are. We are. And so I spent a year working in residential in the nonprofit sector, helping the kids that had been more abused and neglected in the state system in the residential program. And I said, what degree do I need for this? And they said, you got to have a social work degree. So I re-upped, went back to college, got my BSW, continued working in that same program.
Now, BSW, Bachelor in Social Work,
Bachelor of
right?
Social Work. And so I kept working with kids. And then after my BSW, I did more in-home work with the foster care system, became a foster parent myself, my wife and myself. Went on and got my MSW, my master's in social work from the University of Iowa. Go Hawkeyes.
And
Just
you only had to do like a 1 year. If you get your BSW, isn't it more like accelerated? I know other people because I got my undergraduate was psychology, and then I had to do 2 years at my MSW. And then people were like, oh, if you just got BSW, was that the case for you?
it did knock a year off, but it was a 3 year program. So I only had to do it in 2 years. So I had less credits, but because I was already working, the University of Iowa had an alternative program for us so that I'd work all day and then go to the classes at night. And so it still took me, it was 3 years, but I had a lot less credits than some of my colleagues that had to take more classes. So that was a big benefit. So I've literally worked about every level of care that you could possibly, from outpatient therapy to traditional boarding. The only thing I haven't done is acute hospitalization. And so that's the only level I really haven't worked in my career. After I completed my MSW, my oldest was 4.5. And I knew that wherever I started my career at as an MSW, I wanted to stay there. I had the benefit of graduating in the same high school that I started kindergarten in. And so I put my name out there, and in this world, being a male social worker, I was actually getting interviews all across the country and actually interviewed in England and Ireland. And Dr. Len Buccellato brought me down to Georgia to see his campus. And driving through Appalachia, I remember driving onto the campus. I'm not sure what they do here, but I hope they hire me because this is absolutely beautiful.
Mm.
I found the environment I wanted to be in Appalachia. So that's what brought me down here. Is I started as the assistant head at Hidden Lake Academy way back in 2002, and my first foray into the private sector. And I have been in Georgia ever since. And I've worked boarding school, I've worked LD boarding school, therapeutic boarding school, residential, and let my career path guide me where it needed to be at that time. And
Wow.
now I'm still sitting on my mountain. And I did consulting for about 10 years and then took a break. Embark asked me to help start up a new wilderness program down here in Georgia. I don't know if we're going to talk a lot about this, but with the change in the industry, unfortunately, Embark closed their wilderness division in 2024. And so I put my consulting hat back on and find myself talking with you this morning.
Dig a little more into consulting. What do you do do you consider yourself an educational consultant, a therapeutic consultant? Because there's different names and there are different names
Well,
for many things. Well,
yeah,
wilderness therapy, adventure therapy, outdoor behavioral health care. What a, how do you define what you do at Luminos? Because you're also a mental health professional. So you have a background, and you're an educator. You have a lot of different hats.
right. And so for on this go around, I'm doing my practice a little different. And the consulting world has really changed since I was in it 5 years ago. For 10 years, it was placement, educational and therapeutic. Education on the more high school. I love boarding schools. My son has dyslexia. And so I have a passion for working with families and kids in the learning difference sector. But you're right, being a clinician by history, that's a lot of where my love is also. I don't do college. That's a whole different beast out there. If I had a title, I would love just to put my roots back on, Will, and just say I'm a social worker.
Mm.
But that doesn't really translate anymore. So I'm therapeutic and educational consulting. What I've done this time around, because the world really has changed in those 5 years that I stepped away from consulting, families are much slower to sign up. They're much slower. Even when you have a family that signs up and hires you, they're taking much longer to actually go to treatment. As we're talking about all the different stories on the internet that we're hearing, there's fears of families, there's misunderstandings by families. And so, having done programs for so long, I really believe that the consulting has to be more integrated with the programs. And that's got to be a partnership, not I have clients for you. Okay, let's fly you out here. Let's do all these things. I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between consultants and with the programs. I'm also doing program reviews. And that's what I really enjoy doing is a program coming in and saying, Jeff, take a look at us. What are we doing right? What could we maybe do a little bit differently? What are you seeing? The benefit of a consultant is I think I've seen 47 programs this year already. And so it allows us to sit down and say, hey, here's something that I noticed another program is doing that you might want to consider. I've done JCO reviews. And so having had that vision from different angles just really helps me come in both to assess a program as somewhere that I want my client going to, and also to help that program take a look at, wow, what can we do a little bit differently? And I really enjoy that because then it is a collaborative work with the program. What can we do to help you be a little bit better?
And you have a background having worked in wilderness therapy, having worked in therapeutic boarding school, and then on the other side, referring to those programs. So let's go a little back into your story about helping Embark start a new program in the East Coast. And that was called, named, and did you refer to it as wilderness therapy, adventure therapy?
Well, it's really a bit different on that. We always said wilderness. So when we started First Light, they brought me in and Drew Horback, who started the new vision with Steve Sawyer many years ago, really gave me leeway to say, what do you want to do differently, Jeff? You've seen a lot of different things. And so what I wanted to bring in was the stuff that Paris Hilton was saying, this is horrible. That's what I wanted to look at and say, we're not going to have minimalism. So we're not talking beans and rice 3 times a day. We're not living isolationism. So I really I called it an integrative approach. And so while the kids lived out in the national forest here, I was bringing them out of the woods. We were bringing them to the local college. And so we would go to the planetarium. And for me, getting kids, whether it's wilderness or any type of treatment, you have to get them to engage. And so imagine, Will, if I had these students coming out of the woods in all their gear and we're at the planetarium and we're watching a star show. And so the kids are learning about the different constellations, to learn about what they're seeing while they're living out in the woods. That night, my staff are out in the woods with them and they're sitting out there looking up. And that's when the student can say, hey, well, what was that constellation again? Okay. We created the opportunity for engagement and the students took that up. And so now I have a great conversation. And as we all know, in any type of therapy, no one's going to start delving into deep stuff immediately. And so that allowed a conversation to allow the opportunity to connect. Now, hopefully in a couple of weeks, a little bit more in-depth stuff are coming out. So that's really what I tried to bring into the wilderness was do the adventure stuff. We have a lot of neat things in North Georgia mountains that we could do high ropes courses. We could do the canoeing here on the rivers that are around us. But I really wanted to create that integrative model that allowed us to bring the kids out of the field, experience different things, and then get back out into the field and let that healing nature really take that next step.
When you were at First Light, which was basically an outgrowth of New Visions, very trauma informed, right? That was part of the narrative of New Vision. How would that be integrated into the programming?
So you're exactly right. That trauma piece. So all my therapists were trained in brain spotting. Steve Sawyer did the training for levels 1 and level 2. He's very well nationally known for his work with brain spotting. And then Michaela Cherry actually went on to the level 3. So my therapists were absolutely amazing. Jamila and Michaela that ran the groups, and then Kayla Davenport, who did my family. I had an amazing team. What made it really sad when calls this down, all 3 of those therapists were with me for 4 years. So great group. But it really, in the woods, one, you're talking less sensitization, right? And so you don't have all that energy coming in from the school and then the kids after school and all. You could really focus on the kids, but in a relational approach. I think my therapist who have been always talked about Jamila, who was great with our boys group. She would do ninja therapy. And these kids have done need therapy in an office. These kids have done every type of therapy, usually before they get to wilderness. And to walk out there and see Jamila with her pants rolled up in the creek, catching crawdads with a 12-year-old, a young man, but she's doing the same work. She is having the conversation, but the kid doesn't see that because they're not sitting knee to knee saying, how do you feel? Let's talk about this. You have to sneak into it. You have to give the kid again. You have to create the opportunity for engagement. And if that means a therapist standing in the creek, catching crawdads, having a great conversation with the kid, using the same pieces, using CBT, using DBT, using that trauma-informed and trauma-responsive knowledge that these therapists had, that's what I loved about wilderness. You could do it there, and the kids were in their own elements.
Yeah, I have interviewed Jamila, and that is a very highly downloaded episode on stories from Field, how much she loved working at First Light New Visions. And unfortunately, they ended up closing the program. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that and what that was like for you and the team?
It was really tough. We saw the high possibility, as we saw in 2023 and 2024, the wellness program all starting to close one after the other, even the big ones that had been around that I learned from. And it was really sad through 2024. They had closed down our sister programs in Oregon and Wisconsin. And the goal was to move us eventually into a residential program here in Georgia. And we got to a point, and maybe it was me just wanting to put blinders on. We were doing really well. We were fully staffed. Our groups were great. As far as a business, we were making money. And as it got closer, when they finally told us, that's it, we are going to pull the plug here. Dustin Timmons, who's the president of the residential division, recently talked to a group of consultants that I was involved with, and still says to this day he wished he could have kept the new board. But you have to remember that was also the same year that Trails had the death. And when you have a brand new board coming in that doesn't understand wilderness, and Vince got to a part of saying, this is just getting too big. and controversially across the nation with Paris and her push. And so it was a sad day to tell my staff that 27 employees that you've done great work. We're doing well, but unfortunately it's the right program at the wrong time.
Besides the negative narratives out there, you point out it was a new board, a new organization. Basically, I believe Embark was acquired by a larger investing group, and investors who are searching for profits in behavioral healthcare, they want to mitigate their risk tolerance. And so there's the narratives and there's risk tolerance, and then there's possible future risks that a lot of people don't want to tolerate anymore, even though the need for treatment is increasing. The,
Absolutely.
the types of treatment is changing as because Embark does a lot of programs that are now in intensive day treatment, residential, in large metropolitan areas. So I would assume taking a certain amount of potential clients that would have gone to a wilderness therapy program like First Life.
I think you see that's the biggest growth I've seen, I think, in my career is the short-term residential. Embark has them. And you got your Newports out there, your Visions. You're just seeing more and more of the short-term rent. And there's a need. People need to be able to use their insurance. I get that. I think wilderness will come back. And short-term res did eat across the country, not just Embarks. Ate at wilderness because families were thinking I could go to wilderness for 90-ish days, or I can go to a short-term residential for the same period of time and insurance will pay for it. I think if we could have got insurance, and insurance has a billing code for wilderness, revenue code 1006. I know it well. They just didn't want to pay it. And I don't know if we just did a bad job on showing the data to the insurance companies that you're better off doing this than sending the kid to the hospital 5 times over a 3-month period. I think it would have been a little bit better financially for them, but insurance just wouldn't do that. And so that really helped push the demise of wilderness also.
I believe that wilderness is back. It's just different. And there are a lot of different viewpoints because the modern media narrative is they tend to think wilderness therapy as hiking in the desert in deprivation and very survivalist oriented, which New Visions and First Light was not to begin with. So you didn't fit that narrative. And adolescent treatment enrollment actually is dropping. Young adults is increasing. Many years ago, there weren't a lot of young adult wilderness therapy or adventure therapy programs. Now there are more adventure therapy or wilderness therapy programs for young adults than there are for adolescents. So that's a big change that we both gray hair have seen. And years ago, very few outpatient therapists, MSWs, would go out and do walk and talk therapy. I talk to universities all the time about the practice, and there's classes about it. So it's shifting, not unlike 30 years ago when there were no therapists in wilderness therapy programs. So things change like nature. And yet we have an issue, and this season is focused on boys and men. And so I want to dig a little more into that because you're a father. And what did you see over your time in the field? The bigger field is the helping profession. Wilderness therapy is a subgroup, residential is a subgroup. What do you see as the value of young men and boys and old men going out into the outdoors?
Again, it comes back to that key word I talked about, connection. And that's what wilderness does. You can't give away. Dad, mom, uncle, grandpa, whoever's out there with them cannot pull up their phone and say, sorry, I have to get onto a work call for a little while. And, we've always said that's what works for the kids, right? When all of a sudden you're getting away from that pressure of social medias of how many likes did I have? The same way it goes with that family unit. You know, how many families are still sitting down and everyone has their phone out at the dinner table? And so when you're able to get the dads and their sons out, and we don't have that strong share my feelings piece anyway out of us. But when we remove all those other things, and now we can sit there, it's like Jamila in her ninja therapy catching crawdads. When you got a father and son doing a project together, hands on, that is that connection. Then maybe I will say, hey, Dad, I'm thinking about some stuff that happened. But if I don't know he's listening to me, probably not going to bring that out. And that's where getting them out, getting all the treatment programs. And that's a change that I have loved. And I saw that first at Sunrise 15 years ago. They made it clear the family doesn't agree to be involved. We're not going to let them come to our program. And you're seeing more and more programs same way. Parents, you're not sending your child away to get fixed. So if you're not going to be part of this, excuse me, you're part of the issues going on. If you're not going to be part of the solution, then it's not going to get any better. And I think as you're trying to get people out, I had the advantage. I'm in Georgia. I could be on the Appalachian Trail here in 25 minutes from my house. And so we have to create the opportunities, and families got to start investing. How do I get out and about, whether it's hiking on the Silver Trail through Atlanta or hiking on the Appalachian Trail in North Georgia? Families have to start making that collection. Fathers and sons have to be able to get out there and be connected together. And it needs to start earlier. 20 years ago, a little bit more than that, I can't believe, I worked with a group called Boot Camp for New Dads. And it was literally a hospital-based program that was specifically set up for men to come in. So I would run a group and I would have 10 men, and 2 of them are men that already had babies that brought their babies with. No women were allowed in there. And the reason why is, as a 27-year-old having my first baby, I wasn't going to ask questions with my wife or my mother-in-law in the room. We would do what we were taught to do, sit back and let them do that. And so the whole premise here was allow them to ask questions. But I always took the clinical role towards the end of it, saying, you have to decide, what is your relationship going to be like with your dad? And I asked them all, tell me about your relationship with your dad. And I had everything from, we have the best relationship in the world, to my dad and I don't talk much. And when we finally got done with that exercise, said, now you're about to be fathers. All of you are going to have a child within the next 30 days. Is that what you want your child saying about you in 20 years? And I really started making it so you have to connect now. You can't say, I'll play with them once they're out of diapers. I'll play with them when they're... And so I had that community. You have to engage, because if you don't engage now, you're not going to engage after 2 years of training yourself and your child that you two don't do stuff except for once in a while. And so I think I am seeing a little bit more of that, where people realize that we have to have a connection. I think men have done a better job at expressing their feelings a little bit more over the last 20 years. We're still not the best at it, but that wilderness gives the opportunity to, let's just sit down and do stuff. I went canoeing in the Boundary Waters on 2 different occasions with my dad. And today we still talk about it as if it just happened yesterday. And it was 20 some years ago that we did that. And I hope the young adult programs that are coming up and more of that continue to engage the families to be out there and learn about how wonderful this is.
On that topic of an adventure with your dad, do you have a particular story that you would like to share about time in the outdoors that helped you or traumatized you, or just a story?
I did the Boy Scouts. If you ask me about my camping I'm from Iowa originally. And so that was true 4 seasons. So that's when you realize how much your dad knows or doesn't know about being outside. My dad grew up in Iowa, hunting, fishing, living on the Missouri River. And I think that's what we still talk about. Latin Dad Day. I must have been, 8, 9 years old. And we're camping, digging holes in the snow to find a place to put our tent, and how rough you didn't think about that. to this day grow up in Iowa. And I came from the area where the weather forecast included how quickly skin freezes if left uncovered, right? And so I didn't think about it's cold. I didn't think about I thought about the connection that I was having. I probably didn't use those words then, but today I can tell you how much it meant to me that we were out there. So when, as an adult, I'm finding myself, I was probably in my early 30s when my dad and I decided to go canoe the Boundary Waters. That connection was still there. That experience of having fun. My dad laughed. The second time I went, my brother went with us. And we were looking for bait. And we came back to camp and my dad was just laughing. He said, "What are you laughing about?" He says, "I'm listening to my sons, both in their 30s, running around yelling, 'I caught another frog. I caught this.'" He said, "You sound like two little kids out there." And that's what we need to get back to. That's what that brings out to us. So looking at that early stages of sleeping in the snow with my dad to being an adult and having the wilderness brought that kid back out in myself and my brother, and it gave humor to my dad. So that made the whole trip. And he still laughs about that to this day.
That's a great story, and what a connector, right? What a like those stories of being out there and having an adventure, they override other stories in your time with your dad. I have to point out, it's quite odd. I'm in a house that's actually 15 minutes from the Appalachian Trail, and we're both social workers. So, at male social workers, especially like 30 plus years ago, like
Mhm.
there were 3 men in my social work class of 120. And both were Boy Scouts. And that probably all drove us to be really interested in therapy outdoors or wilderness therapy. And many parents listening might wonder, what are the challenges boys are facing that wilderness therapy can help that you think traditional therapy cannot? Traditional outpatient, let us
Sure.
say, or let's say outpatient and residential.
Right. One, it's that resiliency, right? So I use the example, kids have to decide when they're going to do therapy. Many of the students have committed wilderness. They've tried outpatient and they sat back, they crossed their arms and dared you to try to make them talk. And you can't. In a 55-minute session, if the child wants to engage or an adult, they're the same way. If they don't want to engage, they're not going to. In wilderness, they're going to engage because one, that's out there. And I use this example with many parents when they always say, "My child doesn't talk in therapy. Why are they going to talk in yours?" I said, "Because they're going to want to talk in ours." And so I use an example of when Johnny comes out, arms crossed, comes out to the field, he sits on the stump and says, "I'm not going to be a problem. I'm just not going to do anything." And I say, "That's okay. Just if you need to sit on that stump, go right ahead." This is newer. Old school would have said, "You're going to get up, you're going to hike, you're going to do these things." In our program, it's like, "We'll just sit on that stump. If that's what you need right now, then we're going to meet that need." Now we're getting close to bedtime and it's starting to mist outside. We see the rain coming and I say, "Oh, everybody, let's get in our tents." And the kids are getting into their tents because they've been there. They know the system and they're engaged. And Will's still sitting there saying, "I'm not doing anything." "That's okay, Will. Let me go grab my sleeping pad. I'm going to sleep out here with you." And all of a sudden, you're getting a little uncomfortable. And that's where we have to sit sometimes. Families are trying to take away the discomfort too quickly. And sometimes we have to sit in our discomfort before we realize, "I don't think I like this." And eventually, as you're complaining, Will, about it starting to get wet, and I said, "Why are you getting wet? I'm not everyone's in their tents." "Okay. Why are you getting wet though?" And you start seeing the frustration get on because first you're trying to blame mom and dad, blame your consultant, blame this guy that wrote this wilderness book. It's all pooky. But all of a sudden you realize is, well, I can't do it because my tent's not even up. All right. So what can we do about that? And that ownership of I'm uncomfortable because I've created this. And I think that's where I try to get my staff to really work with the kid. The kids create their own discomfort. And we can start realizing that, then it's empowering them. How do we remove this discomfort? It says, I don't even know how to put a tent up. I would love to help you put that tent up, Will. I'm not engaging on, oh, you're going to get wet. You're going to be miserable. All the negativity of the natural consequences, they're natural. I don't need to tell him that you're going to get wet because he's starting to get wet. And all of a sudden, that discomfort is going away because he had to make the choice. And so that's why where parents are understanding. If you wanted to sleep on the stump, I've slept next to that stump many times. And so that's what he needs to know that I am going to engage. I'm going to keep him there. I'm going to stay out here, Will. I'm going to make sure you're safe. And I'm not going to force you into a tent. I can't pick you up and put you into a tent. So I'm going to be here. I'm going to keep you safe. That's where I think that resiliency and the other kids being there saying, I sat on that stump. See, my initials are in there. You don't want to sit on the stump tonight. So we'll help you also. And that's that piece, is that some of that male bonding that you talk about, that you get this group of guys that are really trying to figure their own journey out and then sharing that with the next person. And so that's where I think I can't create the opportunity to connect, but it's that resiliency. I did it on my own. I put this up. It goes away from the male piece because my girls group, they worked harder than my boys will. I got to tell you that. My girls group, Mikhail did an amazing job with that. My staff were amazing. But one of the stories that I used with a lot of my families, I had a young lady that city girl, right? Sitting out in the middle of the woods. She's in tears. And she's in what I call the fluid stage on her first day. Tears, spit, and snot. Any fluid that could come out of her face, it was going on. I can't do this. I can't do this, Mr. Jeff. I don't know why I'm out here. This is horrible. And so we got her through this. About a month later, I'm out there staying with the group, and she's having to throw the bear hang. And this is the first time that she's soloing the bear hang, and she's sitting there talking to me. Mr. Jeff, I just don't think this is for me. I'm not sure I can do. No tears, no spit, no snot. Now she's trying to logically tell me why she's not out there. What she's not noticing, while she's telling me, I'm not sure if this is for me, she is coiling the rope. And as she's coiling the rope, I'm listening to her tell me why she just doesn't think she could do this. I'm watching her tying the knots that she had learned to do. And she's not even thinking about it. She's engaging with me. And then she throws her first bear hang solo, first try. And we sat down later and talked about the situation where she went from being day one and being, oh, I can't do this, to day 30 where I'm not sure I can do this, but she was doing it. She didn't even realize that she is, by the time she got done, she was one of the girls and said, please don't let my parents pull me early. I'm going to complete this. I've done so much work and I don't want to. And the parents were so excited about that. But she did these things innately, but she had to grow into them. I couldn't just say on that first day, in 90 days, you're going to be doing all these things without even thinking about it. But she did. And for me, that's where I realized what we're doing is working. What's going on is having a major impact on these kids when they start saying, maybe I can make some changes in my life.
Great story. And recently I did an interview with the risk management director of the National Outdoor Leadership School. And she informed me that they are hearing a lot of resistance to joining their semester program or longer term program, is that young people just don't want to be away from their phones for that connection, and parents that connection. And so you said earlier, like, young people often don't even understand how they're in their own habits, right? They're so ingrained, and to think about disconnecting from the world is a big piece. And yet, I'm sure you experience a lot of young people that I've been around. After a week or two without the phone, they're like, I am so happy to be away from it. But they especially now, many of them grew up from an early age connected in that way, and their parents are connected. And so their parents are scared too of not being able to connect or track their child.
Yeah.
I have to see that as just a reality.
Right. And unfortunately, I think it's a false connection. It's accessibility, which is different from connection. We're still seeing these 27-year-olds living in the basement, not wanting to come out. And my generation is at fault here, right? When COVID hit, I had two in college and one in high school, and everybody came back home. We went to online schooling, which for years schools said was the worst thing in the world. We'll never let that happen. Now that's all they want to do. But when they released COVID and they said, okay, we can go back to school now, we can go back to college with protections and all that, a lot of people did not go back. They're like, no, the world is dangerous. And for the kids, they're like, oh, wow, I can still work out of my basement. I don't have to go to school. I can do, again, there was a cost savings, don't have to pay room and board. And so my generation allowed that to happen. I'm not one of them. The minute the schools, my kids sent University of Georgia, where two of mine were at, and Emory. So we can go back, but we can work remotely. I said, no, you're going back. You're getting out of the house. You're going back to college. You need to interact. Maybe being the clinician, maybe having to watch this. I knew we are not going to do this. We're getting out of the house. We're getting back to engagement. But a lot of my co-parents out there did not do that. I knew a lot of them that said, no, we're just going to stay home where it's safe. Well, now we've ingrained some 27-year-olds to still not leave the basement. And I'm glad the numbers are increasing out there, but it's increasing to a higher age. I do a lot of program touring, and emerging adult is now the word, not young adult. And emerging adult is up to 30.
Yeah.
And so now we're trying to get these 28 to 30-year-olds out of the basements. And that's not healthy because mom and dad, we are going to eventually pass. And my fear is, are we not leaving our kids with the ability to be self-sufficient if we're continuing to allow them to live in the basement and do all these things? And our job is, as we go back and talk about my dad, I'm as successful as I am because of how my mom and my dad raised me. And that was to be self-sufficient. You want this? Go get it done. And I'm a little worried for this emerging adult piece that when their parents pass away, that they may not have the skill sets.
Yeah. Resiliency is one of the big pieces of it. And I think that you point out every family's different, how you raise your children, how I raised mine. And wilderness therapy, actually, every program's different, just like in scouting, every troop was different. And when you're talking about new visions, I think it's important to point out that all the students there or clients there, they had their own tents, right? They weren't under tarps. They were they had their own assigned tent, correct?
Absolutely. So that's part of that trauma, but not trauma informed. People talk about trauma informed a lot. I don't want people to just be informed about trauma. They better be trauma centered. And so part of that was the single tents. The students during the day, we're going to do a lot of group activities, right? They're going to be doing hikes. They're going to be doing therapy. They're going to be doing adventure activities. But what I wanted at night and how this was set up across all of our programs, at night, this is my tent. I don't have a stranger sleeping next to me. I don't have a kid either snoring and keep me awake or talking to me or having their own issues that I want to sleep. And so I told the kid, this is your sanctum sanctorum. Out here, we're going to do a lot of group stuff. In your tent, this is your boundary. My staff were not allowed to enter a student's tent. We spent a lot of time in the vestibule having conversations. We're doing hand and foot checks. But the kids were told, no one's can, unless we think there's a safety issue, this is your area. This is safety. I want you to know that if we need to take some time here, this is yours. So that for student safety, that was the best. In a generation where we're seeing more treatment being accessible to the trans population, having single tenants allowed us to work with students that were either discovering their identity or fully understood who they were and where they wanted to associate more with. And so single tenants allowed that, whereas a double tent, you had to start being cautious on who do you put with whom.
Yeah, and as you know, wilderness therapy has its critics, and some is justified. I've written about it in my book. I've had critics on the podcast, and certainly inviting more to talk about the good and the bad, like anything in life. And from your leadership perspective, what's the most important ethical or programmatic standards that must be in place to ensure the emotional safety and real therapeutic growth?
Just that relational piece and understanding where the child's at. Old school residential and wilderness was you do it our way and our way only. And I think if you go back to our old social work trainings, person and environment, right? You have to take that individual into account. My interactions, my treatment plan goals for one student is not going to be the same as the other. It shouldn't be a drop down. We got 5 total goals. Let's just pick which one fits the best. These have to be individually developed. And I think that's where programs did get a little bit better at. Not that everyone's going to do the exact same thing the exact same way. Our therapists are having to be much better trained because to say I'm a DBT program only, that's awesome. But now you have to make sure that your missions team is really bringing in people that is what modality they need. In wilderness, my therapists had to know how to do DBT skills. They had to know how to do CBT. They need to know the trauma piece, which is big because trauma is underlying in everything that goes on out there. And so I think what I've seen is we can't just say we do one thing and one thing only, and we're going to do it with everybody because that doesn't work. I think that specialty piece, programs are getting smaller. I think one of the things that made First Light successful, we didn't have the days of the early 2000s where wilderness programs were running 6 to 8 groups. I think at one time, students was up to 120 students during their time in the summer. We in 2022 said we're going to do 2 groups, and we're going to do 2 groups. We're going to have one identifying boys group and one identifying girls group. And yes, could you make more profit if I had 10 groups? Yes. The 10 group programs all shut down one by one because they didn't react quickly to the industry. And so by us saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do it well. We're going to do trauma really well. Allowed us to focus on the students and didn't have to focus on, I was in the field more, I think, than any ED because I wasn't having to figure out how do I fill 8 groups. I was figuring out how do I do 2 groups and how do I do it really well? And how do I monitor those staff?
Hmm. Well, as a consultant, what advice would you give to fathers or mentors or guardians of boys who are struggling, especially those hesitant about sending their sons to wilderness therapy, or the fathers themselves are
Mhm.
hesitant to going to treatment or coaching for themselves?
You know, I think it comes down to getting them get engaged and nothing's going to change. And I think that's a key piece there is sometimes you got to get logical, especially with the dad and say, okay, if this was a business plan, would you invest in this or would you not invest in this current business plan that you're doing? No, there's no return on investment. Exactly.
Hmm.
And so let's take a look at, are you going to create a plan that you're going to get a return on your investment? Are you going to create a plan that is good enough? We'll just let one little piece go there. We'll probably lose money in the aspect. And when you start phrasing it in a way that the brain works, in that, you got to lead them to it. They got to come to that understanding. Let's just do another 45-day short-term residential. We've done that 5 times. And then, Dad, if one of your employees came to you and says, I got this great idea. We've tried it 5 times. It has failed 5 times, but I want you to invest another $100,000 in it. Would you do that? No, that doesn't make sense. Correct. And so sometimes we got to get into that logic model. Sometimes you got to let them understand. I was working with the family. They were sitting on the couch in front of me and this is what our son is doing. We're not quite sure if we're going to do something yet. And so we started talking about what the son was going through, what the family is going through. You got to remember the family's going through trauma also, not just identified clients. And by the time I got done with the meeting, they said, we're just not sure we're ready to do this yet. And I said, okay. I said, so your son's doing all these things, but you're not ready to make a change yet. No, we're not going to do that. So let's talk about plan B. And they were excited. Great. Jeff's got a plan B for us. I said, so let's sit down and let's design what your retirement plan looks like with a 40-year-old living in your basement. Hmm. And they just stopped. And that's when mom looked at dad, hit him literally, and said, I told you that's what's going to happen. And they placed the next week. And sometimes, just like the kid has to decide how long am I going to sit on the stump and get wet, and the family sometimes has to decide at what point in time is the pain tolerance saying we have to make a change. And I've used this phrase forever. The motivation to change has to be greater than the motivation to not change. And for most of our young adults and our adolescents, the motivation is to not change. Keep homeostasis. Don't make a change. And when parents start putting a little bit of pressure on there, oh, the phone's gone. Oh, the car's gone. The motivation to change is starting to become a little bit higher than the motivation to not change. And that's where we have to get there.
Yeah, the whole idea of Outward Bound, that program, Kurt Hahn used that name, even though I know he didn't really like it. But the idea was if the boat sits in the bay, it's just going to rust out and from barnacles and inertia, and that it needs to get out. And the hardest part is to get out. But once that person gets out and starts making the change, that things get better. Jeff, how do people get in touch with you?
They can reach out to me and directly at lumostrategies.com. My cell phone, it's on everything. I've had the same number for years, and 706-973-9211. Whatever I can do to help families, even if it's pointing them in the right directions. A lot of families are only insurance-based, and if we can point them into the right directions to utilize those resources. And there's a lot more resources out there for families nowadays. But whatever I can do to help out the old social worker in me as I'm coming towards the end of my career here, whatever I can do to continue helping this next generation of families and therapists. We need to make sure that we are training the next generation of therapists to meet these families' needs.
Thank you so much. And your cat's been around in the background. What's your cat's name? We're just going to say.
This one's Winnie. She's always, I'm surprised she hasn't been on my desk. I did put my dogs upstairs so they weren't barking at every squirrel that ran by the front window. And
Jeff Holloway, thank you so much for being on Stories from the Field.
Thank you, Will, for this and for your dedication to our field for over the years.